Hello and good morning, everybody. It is me, Julian, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today I'm going to be making an argument about what I would like to call the hermeneutics of disappointment. Along the way, I'm going to introduce you to Deleuze's reading of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, as well as the concept of the hermeneutics of suspicion, and if you're a beginner, also the concept of hermeneutics in general. But what I'd like to do above all in this short video is, this lecture, if you will, is give you an introduction to the relationship between art and philosophy, and how both the artist and the philosopher is somebody who stages what you might call failed encounters with reality. In other words, the artist, like the philosopher, is someone for whom reality is not enough, and yet who nevertheless does not simply turn away from it, but instead seeks something in and beyond, perhaps even through it. But if you're new here, first of all, I'd like to say welcome, as well as to returning viewers. This is a project that I started during the pandemic, in which each and every week I host a live stream philosophy lecture. And the goal of these sessions is to invite people to learn about philosophy and to study it in their own lives, to create a learning community, as I like to call it. But I should also note that these lectures, as Michel de Montaigne once put it about his own writing, are both meant to educate, but primarily are investigations of the... Let me put this differently. Let me start over. What I'm trying to say is this. What I am hosting here isn't just meant to be a lesson. I'm not trying to impart wisdom or anything like that. These are things that I'm interested in, that I'm preoccupied with, and so this is a little window into some of the things that I'm working on and thinking about myself. And if those happen to be interesting and educational to you, then thus the better for it. And so this is a philosophical offering of sorts, and thank you to everybody who joins me each and every week. If you would like to go a little bit further in your learning, and if you'd like to be part of our learning community on Patreon, you can find the edited transcripts for each and every lecture, which by now there are hundreds of lectures, so you can read them. You can also download the audio files, which I'm recording on a separate microphone. And I think this is the best part of the learning community, you can access our Discord server, where I host a weekly seminar where I talk with Jeneline about what I'm reading and thinking, and answer your questions live on air, as well as a recurring ebook subscription service, where every 3 months I release an ebook that corresponds to the previous lecture series. And the upcoming ebook, which will be out in about, 10 days, I think, is going to be on the master, specifically on the idea of the authentic master. So if you'd like to access those materials, please do go over to Patreon. The link is www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. And I'll put the link in the comments as well. Okay, let us begin. So what exactly do I mean by hermeneutics of disappointment? Well, first of all, it's important to note that this term immediately evokes the well-known concept of the hermeneutics of suspicion, as developed by Paul Ricoeur. And the hermeneutics of suspicion referred to a trio of thinkers that Ricoeur identified as essentially applying a, if you will, suspicious reading of reality and of texts, namely Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx. And the point was that, as Ricoeur put it, although I have my doubts about Ricoeur's theory, the point was that Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud looked at reality and cast a doubtful eye upon it. In other words, they were interested in demystifying it, in what would later be called deconstructing it. And Ricoeur argues that here we have not just an attitude of suspicion, but instead a method, that each of them, Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, apply a method of suspicion to the interpretation of reality. And here it can be helpful to think a little bit about what a hermeneutics actually is. After all, it's a bit of a weighty term. It's a piece of jargon, but it's also quite important. Which is to say, a hermeneutic is an interpretive method. It is a specific way of reading reality as a text, essentially applying a certain lens, usually a critical one, to the interpretation of signs as they appear to us in and through reality. This could either be a literary endeavor, you read texts in a certain way. This could be a process of critiquing ideology or politics. And on a philosophical level, it could also be a hermeneutic that you apply to the problem of metaphysics as such. In fact, arguably, the Socratic method, more than just a teaching method, is in fact a system, which is to say it is a hermeneutic. The Socratic method applies a kind of hermeneutic of suspicion avant la lettre to categories of definition as such, which is to say Socrates, as sort of ventriloquized by Plato, is always trying to get to the essence of things. What does something really mean? What is friendship? What is truth? What is a society? And this problematizing is therefore both a way of trying to be very precise about what terms mean, but also tacitly a way of casting suspicion upon the meanings that we are given, that we are supposed to accept as inherent. In other words, one could make the argument, I would make the argument, that the task of the philosopher, and thereby the task of philosophy, going all the way back to Socrates and Plato, is precisely to refuse to accept what exists as given, to cast a critical eye onto not just reality as such, but the way in which meaning is generated. Which is to say, a true hermeneutics of suspicion is always a hermeneutic that is suspicious of hermeneutics as such. And I think this is actually really important, right? Because otherwise it would be a mere pessimism or cynicism, a kind of conspiratorial thought. Every time you're presented with something, you say, aha, but underneath the surface there is some vast conspiracy trying to deceive me. And yet this is precisely not the philosophical attitude. The philosophical attitude is almost the other way around. It is to say that things are hidden in plain sight, that what must be demystified are precisely the seemingly obvious categories that appear to us as something which we need not question. In other words, the hermeneutics of suspicion is never interested in uncovering a vast conspiracy, but instead to say how reality itself is perhaps the ultimate conspiracy. But how does the hermeneutic of suspicion, to which I will return in a moment, then relate to the hermeneutics of disappointment? And why do I want to create this distinction? After all, they seem to be almost similar. Well, the inspiration for the hermeneutics of disappointment came from my reading of Deleuze's excellent text on Proust, titled Proust and Signs, in which Deleuze essentially argues that in Search of Lost Time, Proust's magnum opus, his masterpiece, we have a philosophical truth procedure in which the artist is continually disappointed with reality as such. Every time he accesses something that he believes will be truthful or meaningful, it never really satisfies. It always fails to live up to his expectations. For example, and this is from my own reading of Proust, early in the novel, in the first volume, the young narrator is allowed to go to the opera, and he's exceedingly excited. He writes about the fact that the billboard for the opera contains such enormous promise for him that he can barely even contain his excitement, that it stands for everything that is true and beautiful in the world. And of course, once he goes into the actual opera, by definition, it can never live up to his expectations. He's idealized it to the extreme. But the problem isn't so much that the opera isn't as grand as he wants it to be. The problem is that his very expectation, his very anticipatory framing, has created an impossibility of actually accessing the thing. Which is to say, as he's watching the opera, and as he's watching La Berma, he's constantly thinking to himself, is this real? Am I here? Is she actually singing the way I thought she would? In other words, he's constantly making his experience subject to a kind of metacritical framing in which it can by definition never live up to what existed only in his imagination. In other words, it is lost in the exact moment that it is accessed or gained. It has become symbolically void. Of course, here we have the problem of the objet petit a, which is the central kernel, the nodal point of the Lacanian theory of desire, which is to say, what attracts us is precisely this desire as such. Zizek has a wonderful example that he likes to use. He talks about a Kinder egg, a sort of a chocolate egg that contains within it a little plastic tube that has a toy. And Zizek says that here we have the perfect example of the recurrence of desire that the objet a stages. When you eat the chocolate, you are really eating it as a barrier to get to the toy. You're discarding it. Your consumption of the chocolate leads you to the supposedly true object of your desire, the toy inside. And yet, when you open the toy, it's always a little bit unsatisfying. You're disappointed. The toy isn't that interesting, but now at least you have the chocolate. And here Zizek says we have the sort of recurring failure of desire as such. There always has to be something behind the veil of desire that allows us to keep on desiring. It can never be fully satisfied. And something similar happens with Proust when he goes to the opera. The advertisement for the opera is exciting to him, but when he is in the opera as such, what he really wants is to go home and listen to the record. And I think this is actually quite relatable to me. Like if you go to a concert and you see people filming it on their phones, I think here we have the exact same Proustian problem, which is to say you are there in the moment, enjoying this thing that you have spent money on, that you have wanted to go to, but you're already worrying about the moment when you can no longer access it. And so you are filming it both to have a visual record to watch at home, to say to yourself, I was really there. But at the same time, you're filming it because you fear that you are not accessing it completely or properly. I think the same hermeneutic of disappointment can be seen in a museum. Most museums today are full of people taking pictures of the pictures in a kind of, if you will, Platonic gesture without fully assuming it, right? Plato's argument that, a picture is always inadequate because it is a copy of a copy. Here we have the reductio ad absurdum of someone taking a picture of a picture, which is a picture of a picture, etc. In other words, how do we access reality? That is the central problem. How do we access reality in a way that makes it enjoyable for us? And one of the ways in which we do so is to apply a kind of project, an interpretive project onto reality, an ideological frame, so that reality serves us. This is something that Bentham wrote about, and John Stuart Mill. There's a wonderful passage in John Stuart Mill's diaries where he says that he's super excited about being alive because he has realized that everything he does and encounters in the world is an opportunity for not only self-optimization, but for creating a better world. It's like John Stuart Mill is drinking the Kool-Aid of what today is the central ideological line of Silicon Valley. Let's make the world a better place. And yet, in his diaries, he sort of exhausts himself. And he gets to a point where he says, I suddenly realized that maybe this wasn't possible. Like maybe everything I'd been trying to do, making the world a better place, was itself simply an illusion that I had imposed upon a reality that was mute and indifferent, uncaring. And he actually spirals into depression and is unable to work for quite a long time. In other words, his fantasy frame, that which he applied to reality so that he could access it, had torn apart. And in so doing, he had lost access to reality. And here it's worth reintroducing the Lacanian observation about reality versus fantasy, which can be put very simply. Lacan rejects the binary of reality versus fantasy. in which one can either embrace reality, the real world, or escape into fantasy. Against this, Lacan argues that the only way we experience reality is by imposing a fantasy frame upon it. In other words, that reality is itself both a fantasy, a conceptual experience of that which appears to us, but also that we only really access it, we step into it when we assume the mantle of a fantasy frame, either of our own choosing or one which has been imposed upon us. Emancipation of subjectivity is therefore to be the one who gets to choose their frame, to wear your own mask, as it were. To give you an example, when you are a patient, a doctor essentially says, your illness is now that which defines you. Or, even if you don't want to be defined by it, your body makes you subject to it. In other words, if your fantasy frame is to be somebody who loves going to parties and who sees life as something to be enjoyed, then suddenly the illness can mark a severe disappointment within your frame, within your access to reality. And now you have to change the way in which you conceptualize reality. The Lacanian position, therefore, is not that we can escape this fantasy frame and the manner in which it attaches to desire and thereby essentially formulates our access to reality for us, but we can choose to influence it. We can change our frame and thereby change our reality. But before we get hung up on this, let's go back to the idea of a hermeneutics of disappointment. Proust's argument throughout his book is that whenever we access the thing, it's always disappointing. Like, for example, love. He says he really, really wants to be in love, and he idealizes a certain woman, but when he's with her, he can't really understand what it means to be in love. His character of Swann, for example, has this circular obsession with a woman where he can only love her if he feels jealous, but when he has her, he doesn't really understand what it means to be in love. And at the exact moment that he falls out of love with her, he ends up being married to her. It's not just an ironic paradox that in so doing discards the sentimental cliches that were predominant within romantic literature at the time. It's also an observation about how something like love cannot ever be accessed directly. In fact, as soon as we try to explain what love is, as Lacan put it, we risk sounding imbecilic. To speak of love is to already reduce it to something which can be signified. In this sense, love stands as a failure to be embraced each and every day, which is to say, you can't really know what it is, but you have to know it. It's like the judge who says, I cannot define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Essentially, Proust argues that you cannot define love, but you do not know it when you see it, which is to say it is a failed encounter. And for Proust, this is really the key, right? It's that reality never provides us with what we demand of it, with what we want from it. And that the artist is therefore someone who nevertheless has the courage to stage such failed encounters. As Samuel Beckett once observed, an artist is simply someone who dares to fail as no one else has ever failed. And this is where Deleuze's argument, I think, is quite interesting. Deleuze points out that Proust, therefore, essentially creates a binary category between two types of people. Between those who are merely satisfied with reality, who take it as it comes, who sort of are the passive recipients of reality, consumers, to put it in the contemporary parlance, or someone who has the courage to stage failed encounters with reality, and in the cracks, in the very dissonance between reality and its anticipation, discovers a truth. And this is what Deleuze identifies as a philosophical procedure in Proust, namely the process of disappointment, in which these disappointing encounters are necessary in order for a truth to emerge. And Proust himself puts it, as Deleuze points out, Proust himself puts it like this. He says, an aging artist is someone whose brain has grown too tired to stage such failed encounters, and who therefore must simply be content with the quote-unquote beauty of life, which is to say the failed artist, the aging artist, the one who no longer has his critical faculties, is the one who simply is a tourist in life, taking in all the beautiful and rejecting the bad. The artist, on the other hand, is the one who seeks out truth precisely in those disappointing encounters, those that cannot reveal the truth for him. And Deleuze therefore argues that Proust's metaphysics, his philosophical process, is therefore the creation of signs amidst the failed interpretation of signs, which is to say signs of love, of intelligence, of wealth and status. These signs do not signify what they appear to mean to the narrator. And in this very dissonance, a truth procedure unfolds. And here we can see how the hermeneutics of disappointment is in fact quite consistently laid out throughout Proust's writing. After all, the ultimate disappointment, therefore, is precisely the idea of life as such. And this should not be confused with a kind of pessimistic, cynical attitude that life is all bad. Instead, it's the other way around. It's that the proper task of subjectivity is to go through life and continuously seeking out truth despite failed attempts to do so. Which is to say, for Proust, it is not that we find love or that we find happiness. It's not sort of the cliched categories of being redeemed in this sense. There is no redemption in Proust. Instead, for Proust, the life of the mind, if you will, what Socrates called the examined life, remember the infamous maxim, the unexamined life is not worth living, is for Proust the very way in which we access truth. To put it somewhat simply, to put it in a formula of sorts, the hermeneutics of disappointment argues that disappointment is a more truthful category than supposed satisfaction. In fact, supposed satisfaction is simply a category of the tourist who is always passing through, who is always dipping his toe, his finger into things, who never fully partakes of them. For to fully partake of something is to partake of its inadequacy, of its insufficiency. There's a wonderful scene in Paolo Sorrentino's film, The Hand of God, which is essentially autobiographical, in which the young protagonist encounters a filmmaker who's a kind of stand-in for Fellini. And this filmmaker says, reality is not enough for me, which is to say, I cannot get enough of reality, and yet at the same time, it is not enough. It only becomes real when we impose the frame of cinema upon it. Which is to say, to create a film, therefore, isn't to create a fantasy that stands against reality, but precisely to properly access the kernel of reality as such. Let me give you an example from Fellini's own filmmaking career. When he made Amarcord, which is a fictional, gently, very lovingly satirical film about his own hometown, he was going back and forth about whether or not he should film it on location. Should he film it in the actual town where he grew up, or should he create a soundstage and replicate the town? And in the end, he decided that he was going to create a fake version of his town, a soundstage. And he said he was always puzzled, both mystified in a happy way, but also a little bit annoyed, that whenever his movie was screened to the actual residents of his hometown, they kept thinking that they saw themselves in the frame. They kept saying, oh yes, can't you see in the background, that's where so-and-so lives? And they would literally recognize their friends in the fictional version of the town. And the thing was, the town was never created as an exact copy of the original. In other words, in the fantasy of the town, a truth of the town emerged in which the residents saw themselves. And ironically, if it were the other way around, if he'd actually filmed it on location, probably people would have said, it looks nothing like the real thing, etc. Here we have, if you will, once again, the hermeneutics of disappointment, how the simulacrum of the thing, how the encounter with the actual thing how the simulacrum of the thing can be more truthful, but the attempt to actually depict the thing in its very reality would be a failure of sorts. And here I think we can actually go back to the hermeneutics of suspicion. After all, disappointment invokes the Freudian category of disavowal. In her book on disavowal by Alenka Supancic, she begins with a wonderful Freudian joke. It goes like this. A man says to his wife, "When one of us dies, I will move to Paris." And here we have the Freudian category of disavowal in its purest, which to say death is not something that can be really recognized as such. It's not something that we can really imagine happening. Technically, we know it will happen, but we cannot imagine it happening to us. And the joke is, I hate explaining jokes, but the man who says, "When one of us dies, I will move to Paris," therefore implicitly suggests that even if he were to die, he would be moving to Paris. Disavowal, therefore, is how we continue to embrace a belief, even though we tacitly know it to be impossible or untrue. Disappointment, on the other hand, when raised to the conceptual level, is precisely the opposite. Rather than holding on to a belief that we know cannot be sustained except by disavowal, disappointment says we cannot actually even hold on to the belief as such. In other words, what must be disavowed is the belief so that we can access and enter into a truth procedure, so that we can find the thing behind the thing. Now, I'd like to briefly, because we're sort of getting to the end of this and there's so much more to be said, I'd like to point out that there's a dual quality to the very concept of disappointment as such. And here we can be a little bit like Derrida for a moment, right? We can kind of tease out the different meanings that point towards its essence. Disappointment can take place in two ways. Fundamentally, it is when we do not receive what we want, like a disappointed lover. But secondly, disappointment also takes place when we do get what we want. In other words, when the act of consummation has already taken place. Let's say that you go to your favorite restaurant and you don't get a seat at the table. You're disappointed. But let's say that you go to your favorite restaurant and you take the last bite. You might also be disappointed because now it's over, because it's never going to be as good as it was in your imagination. In other words, disappointment contains that properly dialectical quality of being both that which sustains our anticipation, and yet that which refuses or denies to the thing its completion or fulfillment as such. And in this, the idea or the concept of disappointment actually leads us back to the vocation of the philosopher or the critic or the artist. Oscar Wilde already joked that you'll be disappointed no matter what. Either you don't get what you want or you get exactly what you wanted. And the philosopher, the artist, the critic is the one who embraces this fruitful failure, who continuously stages a failed encounter with things in reality. And in this failed encounter finds a way of life. And it's important to note that this is very different from the hedonist, right? A hedonist simply wants to experience everything. A hedonist sees the world as a kind of buffet table of sensual delight in which they can gorge themselves repeatedly. In fact, the logical endpoint of such hedonism is that one even gorges oneself on all the things that are forbidden or restricted, or even those things that do not give pleasure. There's a wonderful scene in the latest season of The White Lotus in which a character says that he moved to Thailand because he could be a pure hedonist who every day took drugs and drank and was able to fornicate with as many women as he wanted, including women who were trans women, etc. And at a certain point, he realized that this was not enough for him. He didn't simply want to consume bodies, he wanted to be consumed by them, to the point where he wanted to be subject to violent sexual exploitation by the very women he was exploiting. Here we have the coming full circle of hedonism in its sort of ugly inverse, as it were. A logic which we also see within the contemporary capitalist workplace, which is to say the boss doesn't just want to be the person who gets to fire you, they also want to be your best friend, the person who really knows you, etc. Even further consummation of this point, the boss who in his day-to-day life is the strong man, but in his private life likes to be dominated by a dominatrix, etc., told that he is nothing, etc. Of course, the underlying logic, and I'm going on a tangent here, the underlying logic, even within such domination, is that you are the one who can tap out, who can say, this is all a game and I am no longer playing it. But that's an aside. My point here is that the hermeneutics of disappointment, which we must admit is itself therefore a disappointing category, for it does not give us a fully fledged method of interpretation that we can simply objectively apply to reality as such, that the hermeneutic of disappointment is therefore, if you will, a credo. It's a way of saying that philosophy is not about the solving of problems, but it is about the continued reformulation of said problems. And that a problem, therefore, is precisely not the barrier to truth, but perhaps a truth in disguise. And this is the Proustian hermeneutic as well. Proust never argues that we can pierce the veil of appearances behind which there is some truth. Instead, truth lies within this very veil as such. Within that which supposedly bars us from the thing, we find a truth. And this means that Proust's truth procedure is therefore precisely one that demystifies the notion of an idealized content and instead resuscitates into its own ideal the possibility of the form as its own ideal content cast in its very failure. Which is to say, the form which bars us from the ideal content contains within itself the ideal. And within this we can see Proust's, if you will, act of sublimation. The traditional cliche idea of artistic sublimation is that one takes reality with all its bad things and turns it into something good, into something productive. The artist takes negative emotions and turns them into positive truth, into something pretty that can be put on the wall. And yet Proust rejects all of this. The Proustian sublimation is not to take the bad and turn it into the artistic, but instead to say that the artist never fully sublimates anything, that everything is always already sublimated by that which it purports to be and yet nevertheless will become, and that the artist therefore is the one who is not only attuned to this failure, but who can describe it and lay it out in new ways. Therefore, the task of the critic, the task of the philosopher, and, by virtue of Proust's examination, the task of the artist, is no longer to sublimate reality into fantasy, but instead to identify the extent to which not only is reality the ultimate fantasy, but fantasy is perhaps the definition of reality, which is to say the subjective frame that we impose upon our own expectations of reality creates reality. And in the dissonance and the impossibility of the completion of such a project, we find a formal consequence of truth, namely the notion of, if you will, an encounter. All of which is quite an elaborate way of saying that the hermeneutics of disappointment argues that perhaps the only way to live, perhaps the only way to feel in any sense motivated or satisfied, is precisely to seek out these things that need to be put in other words. When you see a painting, you want to write about it. When you read something, it provokes the thought that you can then apply to this painting. You can go out into the world and read about politics or experience what's happening in your own environment. And instead of simply feeling angry or depressed about it, you can read the sign of your times. You can try to identify the zeitgeist and how it speaks. There's a wonderfully devastating passage in the footnote to one of Walter Benjamin's letters in which he says, Karl Kraus has died too soon. Karl Kraus being a famous Jewish satirist and essayist with an enormously biting sense of humor. Walter Benjamin says, Karl Kraus has died too soon because the Vienna gas company has just started cutting off the gas to Jewish households because they're not paying their bills. Why are they not paying their bills? It is because they're using the gas to commit suicide. It's an extremely dark observation, and yet in characteristic Benjaminian fashion, he is identifying a certain irony in this workings. The Jewish figure of suspicion who doesn't pay his gas bills because he is using them to commit suicide. It's a dark image, but it is also one that contains life. It contains thought. It even contains a kind of bleak irony. Here we have the hermeneutics of disappointment in its most extreme form, the encounter with the vicissitudes of reality and in all its cruelty that nevertheless prompts a thought, and a thought that can therein be communicated and shared, and that in some sense proves therefore not redemptive, for how could such a darkness ever be redeemed, but instead that allows us to keep on living. And this type of encounter with reality therefore allows us to step out of the cliched notions of truth and falsehood, of beauty and ugliness, of redemption or sin, and allows us to say that what it means to be alive is that despite the horror, despite the beauty, we nevertheless find ways to impose a kind of subjective will. And now I think we can also finally understand why the hermeneutics of disappointment, therefore, is different from the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of suspicion is essentially an interpretive framework that sees the world as a sign to be read. The hermeneutics of disappointment says that such signs will always fail us. They will disappoint us because they were never complete to begin with. Therefore, the hermeneutics of suspicion nevertheless holds out some hope for the idea that the suspicious elements can be cast away. One of my problems with Paul Ricoeur's argument, not only because I think that comparing Nietzsche and Freud and Marx in this way is not entirely effective, is that the hermeneutics of suspicion always contains a kind of reactionary underkernel, that something is to be suspected. And yet, as we know, the very glance, the gaze of suspicion creates that which is suspected. Against this, the hermeneutic of disappointment is, in a sense, one that has a stronger spirit of intellectual generosity, I think, that doesn't claim to be the sole arbiter of truth, but instead casts a kind of critical and gentle judgment upon the sensual way in which reality always fails to satisfy us, always disappoints us. In this sense, I think the hermeneutics of disappointment, while not meant to be any formal method as such, can perhaps also inspire us, you and me, to interpret the world in a way that feels empowering. And thereby we become not just the passive, disappointed subjects of cynicism, but instead the actualized, engaged subjects of disappointment, if you will. That is my proposition about the hermeneutics of disappointment. I will be hosting a podcast seminar discussion in a few minutes where we can talk further about this. But above all, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for being a part of this community. Thank you for helping me create this space in which we can share philosophical thought. I wish you a very good start to your week, and I shall see you soon. Goodbye.